information from the public on areas in the parish that are prone to flooding. So your feedback is very important to the Corps of Engineers because it will help us to determine what we may potentially be able to take in order to reduce flooding in the parish. So if you're watching via Facebook Live, please feel free to leave any comments or questions you may have in the comments section. And if you're here with us in person, please feel free to ask our subject matter experts any questions you may have after they finish their presentation. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for watching.
Thank you. Yeah, as Ryan said, thank you all for coming tonight. We really do appreciate it. We look forward to hearing the feedback from everybody on what you faced over the last several years. I'm Brandon Schneider. I'm the project manager on this study with the Army Corps of Engineers. We're going to have a variety of staff around the room from the Corps of Engineers tonight. We've got engineers, planners, biologists, economists. So we've got quite the array. So if you kind of have a question, you can find any one of us. After the presentation, we're going to go back over to the posters. So you'll find most of us standing there, and just feel free to grab any one of us. So for today, though, so as I said, you'll just see Corps people walking around. But we have our sponsor here, the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority Board. So we have those members. And the only other thing I want to do is, if there's anybody that wants to be recognized at this time, we can go ahead and do that. So if you're with a local agency or another federal agency or anything else like that, we can recognize you. So, all right, well, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and jump on into this. So Ryan did a pretty good job talking about the meeting purpose. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And then we're going to go into what our planning process is really about, so you understand a little bit more about what the Corps is going to be doing over the next several years here with the Tangipahoa Parish Flood Risk Management Study. We'll go into the authority, some of the coordination, what our schedule looks like over the next 3 years, and then I'm going to turn it over to Katie to really dive in on the planning process. So the purpose of today's meeting is really for us to kick off this Tangipahoa study. This is our first time that we're going to be meeting with you all, and we're going to be meeting several times throughout the study to get public input. So that's part of it, is to hear from you what your issues and concerns are, to help us to develop additional measures and alternatives to tackle the flood risk management throughout the parish. Additionally, we want to be able to feed back to you on what it is that we've come across thus far, so that we can provide that information over and you can see the direction that the study is going. So that last sentence that you see there on encouraging full public participation, I'll touch on it on the schedule, where you can see, like, we have 3 really times where we're going to hold something similar to this, where a public open house or public meetings, whether it's formal or informal. But we're also going to have our webpage up, and you can always send an email there. There's going to be a contact for you to reach out to any one of us at any time, so that throughout the entire study, we're looking for feedback from everybody. As far as this study goes itself, for us and the Corps of Engineers to be able to move forward on a project, we have to have 2 things. We have to have an authorization, and then we also have to have an appropriation. So Congress has to approve us to move forward and do a study, and then we have to get funding to do that study. So here under WRDA, you'll hear me refer to that a couple times, the Water Resource Development Act gave us the authority in 2020. And then through the Supplemental Appropriation Act in 2022 is when we got funded to move out on this study. So for the study itself, the standard process for a Corps of Engineers feasibility study uses a SMART. You'll hear us call that every once in a while, which is an acronym. You know, we're always big on acronyms, but we really try not to use them when we can anymore. But a planning process that's an iterative process. So we'll be doing the same things over and over again when we get additional information to make sure that, like, does this still stand true? But with that, we complete the studies in 3 years and $3 million, or less than those. So less than 3 years or less than $3 million is what our guidance is for us to complete these studies in. For coordination, as I mentioned, our sponsor is the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority Board, but we work with a lot of the additional federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service. We'll reach out to FEMA, any of those standard federal agencies that you hear. We're also trying to work really closely with the parish to understand what they've got going on in the parish itself. Then we also reach out to tribes, the state historic preservation offices, anything like that. So our stakeholders are much larger group than even what's listed on here. So over the course of this study, we'll be meeting with individual mayors to understand what they're facing within their city limits and anything like that. So additionally, as you've probably seen, or if you haven't, there's a variety of studies in the adjacent parishes that's also going on. So we can't just limit ourselves to just looking at the parish. We have to look for like a cumulative effects, look to see what the other parishes are doing that may be impacting us as well. Our authority, though, and I'm going to go back one slide on that, because it's not really well written out here for you, is the parish itself is our actual boundaries of what we can study. So like we can't go up into Mississippi and look at stuff there, and it's limited to flood risk management. So you'll hear us call flood risk management, it's a little open-ended, but we look at a lot of different things from riverine flooding and some of the coastal surge that comes up and causes flooding as a result of that. So, but we've got pretty strict guidelines on what we do look at, but we will be looking at the parish itself and then flood risk management. So with this schedule, as I mentioned, this is a 3-year study for us. So in 2022, we got the appropriation to move forward with the study. So in November of 2022, we signed what we call a feasibility cost share agreement with the sponsor. And this is the agreement that we're able to actually move out and start this study. So of course, the way things go, holidays and everything else, it took us a little bit of time just to get our feet under ourselves. So that yellow star you see is where we're at right now. We're working towards what we call the alternatives milestone. So the big point of that is we look at what we call existing conditions and future without project condition. We want to know what's happening right now in the parish and what's going to happen if we do nothing. So that's why we've got the posters, that's why we've got everybody. We really want to know what you're all being faced with down here. And Katie's going to go into that a lot more when she talks about the planning process. Once we get past the alternatives milestone, we're working towards what we call the tentatively selected plan, and we're going to hold more meetings like this where we meet with you all and start to understand, like, this is where we think alternatives are going, where do you think that we're missing the mark? And then over the course of basically the next 2 years, it's refining that even further, doing a bunch of reviews, offering up the entire feasibility study for public review. And lastly, that leads us with basically October of 2025 is where we'd get a chief's report signed off. This goes all the way up through our headquarters and gets signed off there, and that's when we have the agreement that this is our recommended plan that we would move forward with. So with that, I'll actually turn it over to Katie Fechter.
All right, good evening, everyone. Oh, that was loud. So thanks, Brandon. I'm Katie Fechter. I'm one of the planners on the project. Here, let me do this real quick so you guys can kind of see it full screen here. So like Brandon said, I'm not going to bore you with too much of the planning process for the core studies, but at the top of the slide, you'll see 6 boxes, and each one of those is a step of the planning process, right? So right now, we are in the yellow box. So right now, as Brandon said, we are looking to you guys to help us look at what is on the ground out here in the parish, help us identify our problems so we can start learning to develop some of our objectives and our measures, some of the flood risk management objectives and measures. So right now we're working with the parish, with CPRA to identify these problems. Then we're looking to inventory our forecast conditions and then start to begin to formulate some alternatives in March. So right now, our first gut check is the end of March. So we met with the parish and with the sponsor back in July of last year, and now we're back down to hear from you guys this time. So tonight, we're here to listen to you guys, and we've already had some really good discussions already, so this is really good stuff we're hearing. This is exactly what we want to continue to hear. And as Brandon showed in the previous slide, we'll be back as we progress through these next steps of the study, right? Once we have that tentatively selected plan, we'll come present that back to the public to hear more feedback from you guys. So here's some examples of what we really want to get at tonight. After this slide, there's a series of slides for problems, opportunities, objectives, and constraints. So we've kind of done some initial thinking through those things, and you'll see those on the next following slides. But I want you to kind of think in your mind while I'm going through these presentations, some of the things that you see in your own backyard or in your own neighborhood inside the parish. So do the problems that you may see in these next slide match what is happening in your community, right? Are we capturing these correctly? Are there additional problems related to flooding in the project area that are not captured? Look at the sources of flooding in the area, right? Is it rainfall? Is it the rainfall events that you saw most of the flood damages from? How often are you seeing this flooding? Are there measures or alternative strategies that would address the problems more effectively? And then we're going to talk about constraints a little bit. It's kind of a tricky word to kind of tackle for tonight, but it's part of our planning process, so I'll go into that a little bit more. And then maybe you guys have some additional data out there, some data modeling reports that we should be taking into consideration for the study. We've already talked to CVRA and have some of their, master plans, some of the parishes' master plans, their reports. I'm going to go into some examples of some of the other information that we use. But if there's any other additional information that you guys may have that would be beneficial for our study, we'd like to know about that. So this slide, I'm not going to tell you anything you guys don't know. It's kind of silly to even have this slide in here, right? This is your backyard. This is where you live. But this is the bounds of the study. It's parish-wide, like we've mentioned a couple different times. Focusing on the waterways, right? Of course, the Tangipahoa River. Can see it flowing through top, north to south, starting kind of in the central part, going all the way down towards east, down to the center of the most southern section of the parish. Strawberry capital, right? Ponchatoula is the strawberry capital of the United States, yeah? So largely agriculture, right? So, but we want to also kind of hear, not necessarily problems too, but what are some of the major infrastructure, critical infrastructure that is in your area too that you might have seen flood as well? Or, let me rephrase that, maybe not necessarily flooding in those buildings or residential or commercial buildings, but maybe flooding impacting roads to access some of those, right? We have to account for that as well. So here are some of the problems, right? We're starting from scratch, like we said. What are the problems that we can see as part of our flood risk management study that we've already identified here? So I can go through each one of these. So we see that some of the flood, just by tonight, this kind of matches what we're already thinking, right? From what I've heard, from what we've heard, flood damages from hurricanes. You guys get it all. Hurricanes, storms, rivers, heavy rainfall, right? Damages to homes and commercial property. That poses a life safety risk, correct? I-55 and I-12 is the evacuation corridor. It's my understanding that, was it I-22 was underwater at some point, right, during Ida. 190 and 445 also serve as some evacuation for large communities in this area, and those have been flooded during evacuation times as well. I see a lot of nodding heads, so that's good. Also, access and flooding to government facilities and some schools as well, we've seen, or we've heard that we've seen. So some other problems are, you guys have historically significant resources in your parish, right? Some have potential for flooding. The environment, flooding causes degradation to environmental resources. And then also sea level rise subsidence may increase flood frequency, and it's my understanding some of the lower portions of the parish are having some increased development. So a part of, I'm not going to go too much into this, but we can also look at the term opportunity, right? So as Brandon mentioned, this is a flood risk management study. That is the scope. If there are other opportunities to include other components that are incidental to the flood risk management measures or alternatives, we can try to work those into the study. So a good example of that could possibly be like a recreation feature, but it has to be incidental to that flood risk management solution. So we had the problems. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the goals and the objectives that we have identified so far, right? And hopefully just kind of falling in line of what you guys are thinking to help resolve some of these flooding issues that you're experiencing. So first and foremost, obviously public health and life safety, right? And then economic loss, right? Reduce the economic loss from these flood damages to structures and infrastructure. Protect the evacuation corridors and all the transportation corridors from flooding. I should rephrase that probably just to say reduce interruptions, right? Try to manage the flood risk on these transportation corridors. Increase community resiliency to flooding and increase resilience of riparian habitats. So the constraints are, you can have several different types of constraints in the core planning process. A lot of them that we have identified are just overall study constraints. We can't design something, we don't want to design something that would be impactful to critical habitats. You guys have critical habitats in the lower part of the parish, right? Joyce Wildlife Management Area, some other wildlife management areas further up in the central part of the parish and north, right? So we will identify some measures that would not cause impacts to some of those habitats and the recreational areas. So again, what we're looking at right now is the initial part of the scoping. So part of that is considering, okay, what if we do nothing at all, right? What if the parish does nothing at all? What if the Corps comes in and says, what would the parish continue to look like if no measures were implemented? So we have to kind of look at that and foresee that for you guys for 50 years, right? So a future without project condition is what we call it. So most likely the condition of the resources in the human environment with no additional actions are taken, this is what would happen. We would have increased flood risk, right? That the sea level rise would continue, subsidence would continue, rainfall, riverine bank overtopping would continue. You also have increased storm damages, and that could be frequency or intensity of those storms. We also would like to know, as a part of this evening or in the future, if you guys know of any current or forecasted large development or construction projects, right? So thinking long-term for developing measures, we wouldn't want to propose a measure if there's a large warehouse operation that's going to be constructed, things like that. So the next series of slides are just examples to show you what we have gathered just internally thus far, right? I'm not going to go really into details. This is just a picture. We have the maps over there for folks that haven't walked over to the maps to find some of your local areas. But this is, what you're seeing up here is land cover, right? So this is going to show you, obviously, the marsh open water area. So let me just take a step back. Obviously, the parish is pretty long and narrow, right? So for a slide setup, I split this one in half so you can kind of see it. So on the left is the northern half of the parish, and on the right is the southern half of the parish, with Lake Pontchartrain on the lower right, Lake Maurepas on the lower left. So you can see the Tangipahoa River coming down, so that'll kind of give you some reference there. So this is just land cover, right? Developed, open pasture, wetlands, marsh. So we are taking all of this as an additional layer, as a additional reference to help frame some of our alternatives and measures. Obviously, critical infrastructure. We have a pretty good idea of the hospitals, schools, airport, the Hammond Regional Airport, Amtrak, the government facilities. We know where those are, so we have those already as part of the project, right? Already loaded in. And then the map on the right is a zoomed-in area of the intersection of 55 and 12. So that obviously serves as the major evacuation corridor for the Tangipahoa Parish residents, but as well as, it's my understanding, as well as the New Orleans metropolitan area. So this is a very general map. Again, this isn't used for specificity of you guys to be able to zoom in on your backyards. This is just generally showing you some of the information we can pull in to help scope out our project. So this is just the FEMA flood zones for the parish wide. Again, this slide is just showing parish-wide the major communities that have experienced severe repetitive loss claims throughout the years. So this data is most recently compiled from 2018. That's the most recent data that we were able to gather. We will work to maybe continue to update that, but this was just to kind of show you, again, an example of the information that we are pulling in to help drive forward on this study. So after the initial scoping, we'll start talking about measures, and these are some examples and categories of a typical core planning process. So on the left of this, you'll see the measure type. So those are generally broken out for core studies for structural, right? So for Tangipahoa Parish, these are all examples. These are not to give you any intentions that, you know, all of these may or may not apply to the parish study. But an example of a structural measure would be a levee, detention basin, diversion canal, things like that. A non-structural example would be, you know, the elevation of homes, dry flood proofing, wet flood proofing of homes or commercial buildings, things like that. Recently, the Corps has started to look at nature-based solutions, so engineering with nature as a measure, right? So that could be a marsh creation, a wetland creation, things like that. I think St. Tammany might have had like a proposed historic ridge creation, something like that. And then it could be that there could be a combination of these things, right? So it's not just necessarily all structural or all non-structural. It could be a combination of those things. So again, nothing is proposed for this. These are just examples that could potentially be part of the tentatively selected plan for. So I'm circling back to this slide to end on this, and I'll hand it back over to Ryan to conclude. But again, this is the same slide that I read out earlier to just kind of refresh. Hopefully you're kind of thinking through these things during the presentation of, you know, I want to be able to capture these problems from you this evening. I think with that, I think that concludes my portion. I'll turn it back over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you very much for everyone who attended tonight and everyone who's been watching on Facebook Live. As you can see, we have our website. We also have a physical address where you can mail questions you may have or any comments, and also we have an email address as well. And you could send any questions or comments you may have to either of those there. Again, for people who are here, you're welcome to mingle with our subject matter experts, ask any other questions you may have. And again, thank you for being here, and good night.